Hello, everyone. Can you hear me okay? I'd like to thank Milan and the New York Sangha and Maya and the UK Sangha for their fine preparations, and to all of you for joining today. This is a retreat, so the focus naturally is on practice, our actual practice, to confirm, to correct our practice if something is off. One easy way to see if our practice is correct, true, and proper is to see if the hindrances, the things that seem to get in the way, eventually become the opportunities that they are. We do this by humbly, patiently deepening and sustaining this practice. Quote, delusive thoughts and feelings hidden in lotus threads, end quote. Delusive thoughts and feelings. It could also be rendered as discursive or defiling thoughts and feelings hidden in lotus threads. You know what a lotus is, and the lotus flower as a symbol of Buddhism, a symbol of awakening. This quote is referring to lotus threads. These are very, very thin, very tiny holes in the lotus stem, in the lotus root fibers. They're very, very fine. Sometimes they're used to make a material. It can be a very expensive material for monks' robes and so on. But here the point is simply, they're very, very fine and very, very thin. And yet there are delusive thoughts and feelings hidden in them. The Japanese Zen master Hakuin, who passed away a little over 250 years ago, he wrote about this in some detail with reference to practice. This metaphor of the lotus threads is also mentioned in Buddhist literature and briefly in the record of Rinzai, or Linji, the father of Rinzai Zen. Again, it's referring to delusive thoughts and feelings that remain hidden. Hidden in what? For example, hidden in the relative quiet of Zazen meditation, hidden in the joy of some experience, some attainment, some so-called Kensho experience. What does this quote say to us here and now in our present situation of practice? Once again, quote, delusive thoughts and feelings hidden in lotus threads. I trust you can see from your own experience, truly settled in real practice. like coming home. Are we then able to see these remaining delusions? I've already spoken at some length about the right approach of practice, physical, mental, the breath, and so on. The importance of sustained focus and a lifestyle in accord with this practice. It's, after all, what we are now all doing together, isn't it? Practicing in this way, what was a difficult struggle becomes quite natural. What seemed impossible becomes inevitable. It can't help but happen. We find ourselves truly at home. This is getting settled in real practice. This is opening up to those delusive thoughts and feelings hidden in the lotus threads. If we don't do this in our practice, humbly recognize how you are falling back into delusive patterns, thoughts and feelings, and correct it. This is one of the values of one-on-one, but it's finally up to each individual to recognize and correct for himself or herself, day by day, moment to moment. Yes, in the midst of our busy lives. True humility, so important for the practice. This humbleness, this modesty comes from being without self. It is, in a sense, being without self. This is settled in real practice. What is Hakuin's medicine, that Japanese Zen master Hakuin? What is his medicine for these delusive thoughts and feelings hidden in lotus threads? He refers to this quote and then he says the following. The Mu koan, the koan of Mu, a monk asked the master, Joshu, pronounced in Japanese, Joshu, does this dog have Buddha nature or not? And Joshu's answer was Wu in Chinese or Mu in Japanese, which simply means it has not. No, nope, doesn't. Hakuin is referring to that koan. Hakuin says, the Mu koan is a method that cuts through the subtle roots of birth and death. Gnaw on it, chew it to pieces, says Hakuin, until you chew right through the root of life, finish dying, then come back to life. Hakuin concludes, don't wait till you're old and tears of regret are streaming down your cheeks, end quote. Now, this is the typical Rinzai Zen of Hakuin. Here he has provided the skeleton, so to speak. Let's put some skin on the bones and realize it ourselves. What is really being referred to here in terms of our practice? It can be spoken of as the dis-ease, the first noble truth of Buddhism, dukkha, the dis-ease of life and death, seen through, come to its own end, undone at its root. Can also be spoken of as the great matter of life and death, uprooted once and for all. This is not anything in the least abstract. It is the most concrete event, if we speak of it that way, possible. If we open up underfoot, under our own feet, open up in our own hearts, it is unavoidable. Otherwise, as you well know from your experience, you just keep wavering round and round in the same painful, pointless circles. For example, you might generate a solid samadhi or concentrated oneness during a retreat like now, only for it then to disperse, to break up over time as delusions return. This is practice, charading as medicine, parading as a cure. It's itself a symptom of the dis-ease, isn't it? Could this have something to do with those remaining delusions hidden in our lovely lotus threads? Outstanding Zen people such as Linchi or Rinzai, Dogen, Ikkyu, Bankei, Hakuin, and others criticized other practices, even other teachers. I used to wonder why such severe criticism. Could it have something to do with the dangers of those remaining delusions hidden in our lotus threads? What is this really? Confirm for yourself. Sitting, quiet sitting, as we are doing now, helps for sure. Psychological calming and insight is good, yes. Kensho experiences, as they're called, insights, yes. Koans, working with koans, esoteric techniques all have their place, but they won't do here. Sincere and humble, we cannot delude ourselves, can we? Such practices, techniques, experiences do not of themselves end the dis-ease that is self-delusion, the self-delusion that is the delusion of a self. Taken wrongly, such delusions hidden in our lovely lotus just prolong, extend the dis-ease. Can you deny it? Let us take great care. Quiet sitting, insights, Kensho experiences, all can become poison, a toxic symptom of the dis-ease that remains. A kind of Zenistic double think, double talk results. For example, all is fine when I sit peacefully, but then some conflict remains in my interactions with others. But then, really everything is supposed to be empty, so I guess it's okay. Trying to put together our split minds. It doesn't work. Trying to think our way out of it. A sure sign, the fundamental dis-ease remains. Are these the delusions hidden in our lovely little lotus? Holding on to some ideal state is a delusion. Where does that need, the need for some ideal state, come from? That very need has not come to its own end, has it? Thus, round and round in the same old circles, entangled in, strangled by our lovely lotus threads. It's also a delusion to vainly try and convince ourselves all is okay when it's not. We don't need someone else to point this out. If we humbly look, it is clear it won't do. It is not real. It is not real practice. It is an escape from reality, an escape from real practice, isn't it? Trying to think our way out of these delusions is itself a delusion. It only prolongs, extends the delusive threads. Yes, even if we are sitting in perfect zazen posture when we do it. Right here and now, there is not one thread of delusion, let alone enlightenment. Where does that come from? Quote, intellectual defilements, these could also be called delusions or fixations, mental fixations. Again, intellectual defilements break off suddenly like the Vajra diamond. Emotional defilements are gradually severed like lotus threads. End quote. This Zen expression is rather rare because it dares to distinguish between, again, very broadly, what could be called fixed views or intellectual delusions and emotional defilements or delusions. Zen tends to speak in terms of mind in a very general sense that would include intellectual delusions, emotional delusions, those of willpower as well. But here, this, again, rather rare Zen statement dares to distinguish them. The first one, what are called fixed views or intellectual delusions, defilements, they tend to just break off suddenly when we see through them. On the other hand, with more of an emotional content, when feelings are really involved, those kinds of delusions are gradually severed over time, like lotus threads. It's even using the same metaphor. Let's be clear. Intellect and emotion can be distinguished for practical purposes, as they are in this statement. But they are not two completely different things, are they? They are often one in and as us. We tend to have emotional attachments, investments, as we call them, in our thoughts and ideas, don't we? and our thoughts and ideas can rouse strong emotions. This is something that needs to be made clear through your own practice. What cleanly and suddenly breaks off, done with, and what remains only gradually to dissolve through attentive, patient, humble practice. I urge you to keep your eye, your heart open. This is real practice. Please feel free to stand up and stretch for a few minutes if you'd like. Is everyone comfortable? I hope that we can have Dharma talks in the coming days as well, 2 more Dharma talks, and also for those who have registered from tomorrow, a chance for one-on-one online. But for now, let us turn our attention to the immediate practice. If there's something that I mentioned today that I took up that is not clear for the benefit of all, please feel free to speak up and ask. If you have a question from out of your practice, again, often we find it's not just your question, it's the question of many others as well. So it can be for the benefit of many to raise that question here for all of us to consider. And again, for all of us to work through, not just to ask me as the unquestioned authority, depending on the question. There's a very rich group of people here assembled. They may be much better at responding to some of these questions, problems, concerns than myself. Let us go on and consider together. So I'd like to open it for questions and concerns. Should I hand it over to you, Milan, to host? How would you like to do this?
Thank you, Jeff. If anyone would like to ask a question or offer a comment on what was said, just please feel free to unmute yourself and go ahead and pose your question or comment. Thank you.
I have one I'd like to start off with, Jeff. It's wonderful to see you. It's been a while, so welcome. This is a subject which is very resonates deeply with me. One of the areas of emotional attachment, let's say, combined with intellectual or discursive elements is what they call these days unconscious bias, which is something deep within, a prejudice that you have that you don't even really notice or have a clear rational basis for. It's just part of you, and it affects how you respond pre-reflectively to your surroundings, to people of color, or whatever it is that your particular learned bias may take the shape of. And a question for you and for everyone to consider is, how do we, since it's unawares, how do we in practice raise that issue to ourselves so that we can even realize that there's a problem, an unconscious bias that we are demonstrating.
Thanks, Marty. Yeah, for those who, many of you are not native speakers, bias, Marty mentioned a kind of a prejudice or a bias or prejudice. And again, not, perhaps not conscious, not fully conscious. First of all, I would say that's one of the reasons that we do a retreat. Because if we simply sit, so to speak, in our comfort zone, sit for 25 minutes, 50 minutes, whatever daily, we're able to learn a certain way of sitting, enter a certain samadhi, and so on. But one of the great values of a retreat like this, even if it's online, is to give ourselves hour after hour, and in a sense, have to break out of our comfort zone. And that's where we start to be able to connect with these, shall we say, non-conscious biases. If we simply sit, you see what I mean? If we simply sit within our self-made container, so to speak, we're probably not going to really allow them to come to awareness. You may have a kind of a sneaking suspicion, something may not feel quite right, but you can keep the lid on, as we say. So once again, this is precisely one of the reasons anyway, why we do sustained practice, because then those kinds of things can start to rise up to awareness. For example, Marty, as you well know, sitting late into the night, what in the revered practice in Japan of what's called yaza, literally night sitting or late night sitting. And this is when a lot of this kind of stuff comes up. Just to give a simple example for those who may not be familiar with this, from my own practice, I can speak of having those kinds of insights where I really see through the nature of the self, not just of myself, but of everything that appears to have a self. And for a period, days, weeks, even months, the conflict between selves is virtually gone, it disappeared. There is no other, there is no other. Even though you're involved in activities in the world, doing all kinds of things. But what you may find is, yes, after a very clear insight, for example, into the nature of the self, there is no such thing. Try as I might, it's just not there. In myself or in that other person, for example, that I thought was such a jerk. There's no self there. And yet, as Marty is alluding to, over time, it almost can seep back in. For example, in a conversation with someone, an encounter with someone. Those old wheels, so to speak, that we thought were gone, may all of a sudden start working. Simple example, I start seeing the person that I am encountering, not as the person that they are, but as, for example, my sister or my mother or a spurned lover or whatever. And I'm no longer encountering them. I'm encountering something in my own head. Well, this is not a good way to be with another, is it? So this is just a simple example of how these so-called emotional delusions can all of a sudden come up and be triggered, for example, by, as Marty mentioned, the appearance of a certain person. A person may look like someone that stirs something in you. This is something going on in you, you see. And to be aware of that, yes, to be aware of that. This is where sustained practice, really giving ourselves, and again, real humility to remain open to, I would say, to want to see the delusions that remain, to want to see them, to realize we need to see them. Marty, I don't know if that helps, but please, if you would like to say anything else or anyone else from their experience, please feel free.
Hi, I'd like to respond to what Marty said and ask a question of my own. As far as unconscious biases go, if I'm not aware of them, then I am just simply obliviously acting in accordance with these unconscious biases. And I don't think there is a human being alive that does not possess some element of unconscious biases. That's just my personal take on it. I do tend to agree that through awareness and being open and having faith and trusting in the internal process of the inherent human nature being a growth and a loving process, that those can become elucidated and hopefully healed in terms of, you know, biases that I carry, that I believe all people carry. So that's my response to that. And then the question I had, Jeff, in something that you mentioned, which was hindrances becoming the vehicles, the transformation of hindrances into actual vehicles for practice. I find that to be an interesting concept, and would like to hear your take on that. What exactly do you mean by a hindrance becoming a
Opportunity word.
an opportunity? Yeah, I think that's what you used. Thank you.
Yeah, first of all, you know, Marty's concern and his comment is important, and we will return to it in the later Dharma talks. We're not finished with that yet. Happily. But now to turn, Milan, to your question. Speaking from my own experience, for me, for years in the practice, you know, hindrances were hindrances, things that got in the way of physical issues, for example, pain, sleepiness. It could be, that's the real point, isn't it? Just about anything can become a hindrance, can't it? We're not children anymore, so we know, don't we? Pain can certainly be a hindrance, can't it? But so can pleasure. It's clear, isn't it? Pleasure can be a hindrance just as much as pain can be. It's not about getting rid of one and increasing the other. So perhaps especially in the beginning of our practice, I know I speak from experience here, almost anything can become a hindrance. One example that comes to mind, I remember sitting there in one of my first retreats. Marty, I don't know, you may even have been there. This is 40 years ago, 41 years ago. And it was so painful. It was so painful. And I was just waiting for that damn bell to ring to signal the end of the zazen. And I swear it was going on forever and ever. I swore that head monk was doing this on purpose because he knew how much pain I was in. And then about 2 minutes later, as we all know, right, the pain's gone. And it's gone. The pain disappears. And of course, then you look over out of the corner of your eye and you see the head monk. He's picking up the bell to ring it. And you know what went through my mind? Guess he couldn't handle it, huh? It was too much for him, huh? It was so amazing to see what my mind, this was all, of course, just in my own mind during a one zazen period. I went through hell and back and finally was able to say, oh, I guess he couldn't handle it. Just amazing, just amazing. The point, just about anything can become a hindrance if we let it. And when we really give ourselves to the practice, those very hindrances, as they seem to be, can become the way through, can become opportunities. I used to try to get away from people that I thought would disturb my practice, situations that I thought would get in the way, slow me up. But if you're practicing truly, you start to see that they are precisely the things you need to go to, not try to get away from, but to go toward. We're not looking for trouble. I'm not trying to stir up trouble. But if there's something there that seems to threaten you or challenge you, when the time and the conditions are right, go, pick it up, embrace it, see what it is, see it for the opportunity that it is. I trust that makes sense to you, Milan?
Yes, it does in the living practice sense. It makes sense to me when you say when the opportunity presents itself. It makes sense, for example, in a difficult interpersonal interaction, to resolve it, forgive the person, deal with it, don't forgive the person, don't, whatever it is that is the resolution, to let that take place. So it's almost it's a living practice. I guess what I was getting at was, on the cushion, for example, especially in early days of a retreat, I often will go through several phases of letting the weeks leading up to the retreat sort of dissipate mentally, and there are repeating themes that occur, and I consider those hindrances. So then I ask myself, are those opportunities? And maybe so and maybe not, but thank you for your response.
If anyone else would like to speak from their experience, please feel free. David?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Jeff. And thank you, Milan. The, the practice for this retreat for me has been very much what you just talked about in a very strong way. So let me just very quickly highlight that and then offer some thoughts from my own experience. I have an old friend that I've spent many years sitting with, and we differed a number of years ago on our path. He went down a different path. And I had an interaction with him over the weekend, and it was quite profound. And that practice was really much different than what many of us would consider to be the practice. And there's a part of me that wants to say, no, 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 that's not the practice. And so a part of me that has this arrogance that wants to correct that. And so for the last day and a half, if you will, that has been very much on my mind. And watching that and watching how within myself, within my own lotus fibers, threads, trying to fix something until I realize that the thing I'm trying to fix is really me. Um, and that part of me doesn't have a substance to it. And so there's this part that humbles us, humbles me at least, in this practice of looking closely. I think these sustained practices like this allow us to confront it head on. We're not allowed to go around it. I wanted to focus, on the parts of a practice to deepen it. And no, that's not what was there. What was there was this conflict. And the conflict eventually became there was no separation between him and me. And so out of that is something that doesn't willfully come, at least for me, is not willful, but it's coming out of the practice. And out of that, I can see compassion. I can see a practice that is evolving, um, not just for myself, but for him as well, and doesn't see the need to fix it. And that happens just through the practice. I think a very genuine, a very honest approach in just sitting with what's there and seeing it clearly. Thank you.
Thank you. Tobias?
Yeah, thank you for your valuable words. I'd like to address a difficulty in my practice and ask you to briefly maybe comment on that. I'm struggling sometimes with two aspects of our practice. One is piercingly questioning yourself, and questioning your intellectual views and questioning who you are. And on the other hand, like you said, coming home, or in the words of Linji, just be natural, don't strive. So it's hard for me sometimes to bring that together.
Thanks. It's not just your concern, I can assure you, but we don't need to create problems, for sure, but to just honestly look at what, as I would put it, what remains. What remains? If you've had a clear and decisive insight or experience, a bunch of stuff has just broken off like the Vajra diamond. It's done. Good. Inquire. What is now gone? What is now gone? And what remains? What remains? They're both equally important. Do you know what I mean?
Not quite sure. Let me give you an example out of my practice. If I'm using a question like a koan, like who is this or who am I I find myself from time to time doing that more and more routinely, and it doesn't really grab myself anymore. So I go back to that and ask more thoroughly. So what is it? Who is it? But then again, isn't it, just like letting all go and trying to come home, as you say, or trying not to strive, like Dingy said. What should I do?
Yeah, I would say they're really not two different approaches at all. When one comes to its consummation, there is no striving at that point. But up until that point, you can't help but strive, can you? There's still some dissonance, if we're honest and humble, right? You see what I mean? We don't need to create problems, but if you still feel some dissonance, so to speak, well, that's why we give ourselves to the practice. You don't need to create problems, but you just need to humbly, honestly, clearly see, as I would say, what remains? What is there? What is there? So that question, who is this? It's not simply a forceful looking into something. It is you yourself asking directly into the source of yourself. This one here and now, nothing abstract at all. This very one that maybe is really confused and frustrated, or maybe feels really, really clear. It makes no difference. This present one. Who? The one asking is inseparable from what is being asked, isn't it? You follow? It's not something other. The one asking is who is what is being asked. Here's where the koan practice really works. You see, it's not like a normal question. Where is the pen in the room? Here it is. The one asking is none other than what is being asked. And yet, if we're honest, they're not fully one, are they? They're one and yet two. And so we might say, struggle of something like koan practice. But you don't need to create another problem. Simply see what is there. If you can honestly say, there's no split whatsoever, within, without, above, below, fine. Test it. Test it. What remains? I would say, really, you're talking about two sides of the same coin. So you don't need to worry about, I need to do this, but then there shouldn't be any striving. If something remains, you can't help but strive. And you will get to the point, you've touched it already, haven't you? Huh? Where you realize that striving itself is just continuing the vicious cycle. And something falls away. Good. Continue right through there. Okay?
Okay, thank you.
Tina.
So I have taken up actually the koan, What Remains, probably for the last 10 years. Over the course of my life, I have had, I think, fears and anxieties. Just I've been sort of fearful about things. And my approach has been a spiritual one of going towards. So I don't go away. I know about that, and I go towards. And this last couple of, I guess, a month, I have been in Germany, and I am now stuck in the Netherlands until the next week. Hopefully I'll get out soon. And when I found out that I wasn't going to be able to go back home, I tested positive for COVID before I got on the plane. And I don't have any symptoms. So here I am in the Netherlands, and I want to be home, but I'm not. And so what remains is pretty clear to me. I got distraught. I got anxious about it. And for me, only if I move towards what I am afraid of will I finally get to the bottom of all this. So I have some sense that I went towards something. I asked what remains, and I got it. What remains is you get anxious when things don't go as you predict. And that's a kind of a bias for me, because I don't like feeling like this. It's pretty much, I have to say, it's pretty much dissolved though. I mean, I have, worked with it. I'm sitting a lot. I've embraced it. I'm pretty much okay with whatever happens, but it wasn't easy. And, the next chance that I get, I'm going to keep doing this until whatever remains in my self as a hindrance dissolves. But like, I think maybe Milan and Marty, we don't always know what that is. I don't always know what that is until I'm confronted with something that causes me dissonance. And then I know. I mean, that's the only way to, as far as I can tell, is to sit and move and not deny or avoid what you're afraid of, or or angry about, or don't like, or something like that. So I have some experience with a koan that came to me and that I use, and it's a living koan. So what remains, I'm willing to open up and sort it out without, whatever biases, whatever fears, intellectually, emotionally, I'm going for it because it's painful not to. It's a hindrance not to. Anyway, that's so. I hope that's helpful.
Thank you. Yeah. If you want to test your practice, take an international flight nowadays. Go to the airport.
Oops.
No anxiety, nothing arises. I can speak with some experience here too. Yeah, it's a great test, isn't it? Huh? It's a great test. Yes. Thank you, Tina. I think we're about to run out of time, Milan. My apologies. I trust these comments, questions, concerns are helpful for everyone. Please let us now return to the practice. Thank you, Milan.